Hi, I'm Zach Schaefer, CEO of United for Infrastructure and a proud partner of the Value of Water campaign and the American Society of Civil Engineers. I want to ask you all to recall the very beginning of this pandemic when we were all told to be careful, don't touch your faces, and wash our hands often. That, of course, presupposes that you have adequate access to water and sanitation, something that 2 million Americans don't have. It assumes that you can afford to pay your water and your wastewater bills, and it assumes that those utilities have the resources, the staff, and the infrastructure they need to get that water to you and to take it away. Infrastructure is not an end, it's a means to an end. It couldn't be more true of our water infrastructure. The true value of our water isn't in the pipes that bring it to us or the plants that treat it. The real value is in the health of our children and our families, the trust they place in the water that comes out of the tap when they turn it on, and in the prosperity of our farms and factories and retailers and restaurants. So I'm so grateful to VOW and the American Society of Civil Engineers for writing this report and that they're releasing today. And while the plans for this project, like the critical needs it highlights, predate the current public health and economic crisis, it could not be more timely. As we confront the dual crises of aging and inadequate water infrastructure and the worst economic crisis in a century, we have a singular opportunity to solve both of these challenges together through bold action and investment. We can fail our water infrastructure and let it fail us and our economy, or we can meet the moment and ensure that the investments we make in the broader economic recovery, in manufacturing and agriculture and healthcare and restaurants and tourism, and so much more are enabled by the modern, efficient, affordable water systems we so desperately need and honestly deserve. Now, it's my honor to turn it over to Radhika Fox, CEO of the U.S. Water Alliance and leader of the Value of Water campaign, to kick us off with our first conversation. And before I do, I really want to thank ASCE and Radhika and the Value of Water campaign for their work over the last several years to really drive home water's value and impact across our communities, our economy, our health, and our society. So Radhika, thank you. And with that, over to you.
Thank you, Zach, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I am truly honored to represent the Value of Water campaign during today's event. The Value of Water campaign is a group of some of the top leaders from across the water sector that are dedicated to building public and political will for investment in our nation's water infrastructure. We are really thrilled to be partnering with the American Society of Civil Engineers and United for Infrastructure on this event. So thank you for the wonderful collaboration. As Zach mentioned, millions of Americans all around the country are really struggling with this dual crisis of COVID-19 and the worst economic crisis that I have certainly seen in my lifetime. And elected officials all around the country are thinking hard, what are the best ways to jumpstart our economy, to jumpstart growth, help put people back to work. And in that context, the findings of the report and the discussion today will really illustrate that investment in water infrastructure is one of the best bets that we can make as a nation. To help us kick off this discussion, I'm really thrilled to welcome Congressman John Garamendi to join us in this discussion. Congressman Garamendi has represented California's 3rd District for about a decade. Prior to that, he served as the Deputy Secretary for Interior in the Clinton administration. And as a California resident, I can attest to the fact that he was instrumental in resolving so many important water disputes here in California. Something that folks may not know about the Congressman is that he is a 4th-generation cattle rancher and an outdoorsman and is very passionate about both agriculture and the environment. Congressman Garamendi, thank you so much for joining us today. I want to start off by first sending you well wishes. I hope that you and your family are safe as these wildfires continue to blaze across California. I'm calling in from the Bay Area this morning, and we're lucky that our air quality is good at the moment. So Congressman, to kick off our discussion, our new report really shows that the water infrastructure investment gap is widening, and that the failure to act puts our economy and our families at risk. Can you talk some about the water infrastructure priorities in the House right now to help close this gap?
I'd be delighted to do so. But I got to kind of get past my current problem. I am at my ranch, as you said, fourth generation rancher. And from the very earliest days, I remember going around trying to make sure that the springs were still providing water for the cattle. And early this morning, I left a little cabin that our family has up in the mountains, way up high, to drive down here. And because I had a bear problem, the bear broke into the cabin, decided it was hungry. So I had to deal with that late last night, and I'll probably go back and deal with the bear later today. But in the meantime, as I was driving down to get back to my ranch in this Zoom conference, I passed along on Highway 4 in Calaveras County a major water project that is underway, updating a water system for the communities that stretch into the mountains. And recognizing how important that is to that community, they passed a bond to pay for that. But the initial water system in that area was actually built in the 1960s using the federal government's support for water infrastructure programs in that period of time. We're not there today. And we need to go back. We need to go back so that the future recognizes that these water systems, in that case, a semi-rural water system or an urban water system, are absolutely essential. I recall my days as a Peace Corps volunteer in Ethiopia. Once again, looking at the water systems, the people in our village were taking water out of a stream, heavily polluted, but doing the very best they can with 5-gallon cans on the side of a donkey, providing water for that community. And so we built springs. Going back 30 years later, actually 40 years later, that community, and looking at a water system that we had planned 40 years earlier for that community being built. So where are we in America today? We're living off yesterday's investment. And yet we need tomorrow's infrastructure. The WIFIA program needs to be reauthorized, needs to be expanded, needs to be a 50-year, not a 35-year program, needs to have low interest loans. My God, the federal government can borrow money at less than actually negative borrowing would probably be in order given the pandemic and the economy. But certainly 1 or 2% is not out of the question for long-term borrowing by the federal government. We need to borrow that money. We need to put that money into infrastructure. Here in California, we don't have adequate water. When I was the deputy secretary, Secretary Babbitt says, "We'll take care of California water." I said, "Well, thanks a lot." It is today a continuing problem. We need off-stream reservoirs. We need to use our aquifers. The largest reservoir in California are the aquifers of Southern California. They're not used. They're contaminated. They can be cleaned up. We can recycle in Southern California. I often say the 5th biggest river in California, on the west coast of the Western Hemisphere, are the sanitation facilities in Southern California. Taking water, dumping it, cleaning it, dumping it into the ocean? No. Clean it, put it in the aquifers, recycle, reuse. These are the opportunities that present themselves. We've made a little progress. We do have an off-stream reservoir that will soon be under construction called Sites Reservoir in Northern California. This provides the fundamental water storage. As I was coming out of the mountains, I was looking at some of the work that the federal government, the Forest Service is doing in thinning the forest. Absolutely necessary for fire, but that also provides water into the streams. The high mountain meadows, overgrown. Once those were storage reservoirs, those can be reused if we properly manage the mountain meadows. So there's a lot of things that we need to do, but all of it requires federal government participation. And that's what we're talking about today. We have a major infrastructure bill that's sitting over in the Senate. There's a lot of water programs in that infrastructure. We need to move that. We can finance it both with long-term debt as well as with clawing back some of the unnecessary benefits that were given to major corporations as well as to the super wealthy. All of these things are possible. We need to get at it. But right now, with the COVID and the pandemic, we seem to stall out, in part because of that, but also because of the election. When this election's over, all of us need to put 100% of our effort into the federal government retrieving the role that it once had as the major infrastructure financer for America's water systems, whether they are large reservoirs, whether they are aquifers, or whether they are community water systems, such as I saw as I came back to my ranch here in the foothills of California.
Thank you, Congressman, and could not agree more that we need to all come together and call for greater investment once we get past this election. And I will say that there's such a multi-benefit outcome when we invest in water infrastructure. It's public health, it's economic revitalization, and it's climate resilience. And speaking of climate resilience, you have long been an advocate on these issues. You've been a great leader on issues around drought and water supply in the West. I feel like climate scientists could not have predicted what's happening right now from California to the Gulf Coast to the Midwest. Tell us what.
May I agree with you? May I take the opportunity to disagree in a kindly way?
Absolutely.
In 1997, I was the Deputy Secretary at the Department of Interior. The Kyoto Climate Conference, which was 10 years following the Rio de Janeiro Conference, was about to take place the following, I think it was 98, that conference was to take place. President Clinton and Al Gore called in 5 deputies together with the EPA and the environmental organization at the White House, sat us down and said, okay, figure out what we need to do for that climate conference. And so we went to work on it. Several months later, my task was the Department of Interior, the lands and the like. Coming out of that conference, we predicted, or ahead of that conference, we predicted that there would be massive die-off of conifers as the climate warmed, and that the species would be seriously threatened because their habitat would be radically changed. We've seen that die-off along in all of the mountains, at least in the west of the Mississippi River, and it's happening. We also predicted that there would be major storms that would occur, that there would be prolonged droughts. All of those things have happened. I recall very clearly Gore, not the work that we done, but the work that NOAA had done about a major hurricane hitting New Orleans. Al Gore said, John, go down and talk to the folks in New Orleans about this, get them prepared. I went down, talked to the local government. I said, the storm's going to happen. You're going to have to get prepared. All of those things were taking place. One morning I woke up and I found on the television a storm that was about to hit New Orleans. And I told my wife, oh my God, that's precisely what we predicted. And here we are. I am going to take a short break because I have a low battery. So excuse me for a moment. I'm going to go on mute and I'm going to go on no video. And then I am going to come back to you, okay?
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you for your service to our country. And this is the world of Zoom, right? Batteries and connections. Let me know.
So I am exiting for a moment.
Okay, thank you, Congressman. We really appreciate your work and thank you for your leadership in Congress. Next, I'd love to turn the conversation over to Emily Feenstra, my dear friend of the American Society of Civil Engineers, who will be moderating today's panel discussion. Emily?
Sure, thank you, Radhika, and I'll be prepared to talk for a little bit and then maybe turn it back to you when the Congressman can rejoin us. But it's great to work with you again, and we really jumped at the opportunity to partner on this report with the Value of Water campaign and the U.S. Water Alliance. And I just want to give some context for this report that we're releasing today. It's actually part of a series for ASCE called our Failure to Act series that we started back in 2011. As most of you know, we've been doing the infrastructure report card since 1998, and the grades have not been good across 16 categories of infrastructure. They've struggled to get out of the Ds. And it's a robust assessment of infrastructure categories, but really at its core, it's a snapshot in time of our infrastructure conditions and funding needs. And as we're looking at the D plus grade in 2017, we wanted to answer the question of, so what? What does it matter to the average American family that we have this D plus? What does it mean in terms of GDP and jobs and the overall national economy? So that's some of our objective behind the Failure to Act studies and really looking at the link between the health of our infrastructure and the national economy. It's something we all know intuitively, right? We know that water main breaks shut down businesses. It's not just inconvenient, but costly. We see that with power outages as well, planned and unplanned, and unfortunately, we're seeing that now in California. We want to quantify what that cost is. And really with this water report, what's exciting is that we're looking at the flip side. What's the opportunity if we choose to invest? So with that, I think we're going to go through the results of the study today with Katie Henderson. She's a senior program manager at the U.S. Water Alliance. And with that, I will turn it over to Katie.
All right, thanks, Emily. I am thrilled to be here to share the results from this report from the Value of Water campaign and ASCE, titled The Economic Benefits of Investing in Water Infrastructure, How a Failure to Act Would Affect the U.S. Economic Recovery, which you can now download from the Value of Water website at thevalueofwater.org. This research was conducted by EBP, led by economist Steve Landau, and it shows that investment in water would reinvigorate the economy, create jobs, raise wages, and protect the public health of all Americans. But if we fail to act, there would be staggering economic losses to GDP, jobs, wages, and increased costs to American families. This study presents 10 and 20-year projections from econometric modeling of two future scenarios, one where we allow current investment trends to continue even as our water systems age and deteriorate, and one where we adequately invest in our systems. Our team relied primarily on a dynamic inter-industry model called LIFT, which is housed at the University of Maryland. The model generates projections for the effect on other industries, on job growth, business sales, export value, gross domestic product, and household disposable income. To model the future scenarios, we first had to understand where the US currently stands in terms of what our capital and O&M needs are and what we're spending, including at local, state, and federal levels. So the difference between the need and actual spending is what we call the water infrastructure investment gap. As our water systems age, they need to be replaced and rehabilitated. So each year, our capital, water, and investment needs are going up. So spending, however, as you can see here, has not kept the pace. We estimate that the total capital spending on water infrastructure in 2019 was about $48 billion, while the total need was about $129 billion. So that's a gap of $81 billion. When this is projected out over 20 years, based on recent and current investment levels, the annual gap grows to $136 billion in 2039. The annual gaps, when totaled together, equal a cumulative investment gap of $2.2 trillion over 20 years. So while capital needs continue to climb each year, the share of capital spending borne by the federal government has shrunk. You can see on this graph here that in the mid-70s, there was actually an influx of federal spending on water infrastructure, and part of that was thanks to construction grants that followed the passage of the Clean Water Act in 1972. In 1977, the federal share of water infrastructure spending was 31%, and in 2017, that number shrank to 4%. In the absence of federal funding, utilities and municipalities have to rely more on local sources, especially local ratepayers. And this is a particular challenge for smaller, rural, and low-income communities. It's important to note before we move into the modeling results that water infrastructure is central to the productivity of our entire economic system. While virtually all industries rely on water, even if just to bring potable water to and flush wastewater away from buildings and facilities, but many industries rely more directly on water as a core process or a core component of their processes. So on the slide here, aside from agriculture, mining, and power generation, the most water-intensive industrial sectors are paint manufacturing, paper milling, and alkalis and chlorine manufacturing. When water systems become less reliable, these sectors are especially at risk. The LIFT model that we relied on to generate our economic projections is designed to measure the impacts that changes in one industry, in this case water, have on all these other industries. And the results are stunning. So let's dive in. The first scenario we modeled was projecting current underinvestment trends out over the next 20 years, and we used 2019 economic measures as a baseline. In 2019, we estimated that the most water-reliant businesses spent about $51 billion as a result of water service disruption. So that's things like breaks, shutoffs, and flooding events. As water systems age, those events will become more frequent and more expensive. Water service disruptions will cost the 11 most water-reliant businesses $250 billion in 2039. The impacts don't stop there. As water infrastructure deteriorates, street flooding, shutdowns, and damage from storms would increase, and those interruptions would increase production costs for businesses, and prices for consumers would climb. So this leads to a reduction in domestic and foreign demand for US manufactured products, which would reduce global competitiveness and produce a domino effect across almost every indicator of economic well-being in the United States. By 2039, the cumulative impact on GDP is estimated to be a decline of 1.2% or $2.9 trillion. The consequences of less reliable water service would impact individual American families too. Think about it like this: if a business is constantly having to pause their production processes to deal with flooding or water service interruptions, they will be less efficient and productive. They may not be able to pay their workers as much, or they may have to lay some of them off. The model showed that as the impacts accrue from continuingly underinvested water systems, workers would see reduction in wages and disposable income. Over 20 years, we would see $1.4 trillion in cumulative disposable income loss. In 2039, 636,000 jobs would be lost annually. American households would have to deal with the cost from water and wastewater service disruptions too. In 2019, service disruptions and flooding cost households about $2 billion. We estimate by 2039, that number would be 7 times higher, reaching $14 billion. All right. We are missing a few of my slides. All right, we'll get this back up in just a second. All right, so I was talking about the cost to American families. And let me get my screen sharing back up. My apologies. All right, so we will see about $14 billion in cost to American families from water service disruptions, but there would also be health and medical costs from failing water systems. So as we probably know, sewer overflows can expose people to contaminated water. Deteriorating drinking water systems can leach heavy metals into the water supplies. Higher rates of illnesses, hospitalizations, and lost working days would cost American families about $7.7 billion in cumulative health and medical costs due to failing infrastructure. But I'm not here just to deliver doom and gloom. The second scenario was that we modeled was one where we close the gap between water infrastructure needs and water infrastructure spending. What will the economy look like if we invested adequately in our water systems? It turns out the economic benefits from investing in water infrastructure are enormous. So in this scenario, we assumed that the United States met 100% of our water infrastructure investment needs, which would mean an additional investment of $2.2 trillion over the baseline over the next 20 years. Closing the gap would improve water system performance, which would increase productivity and efficiency in other sectors. Cascading effects from this infusion of economic investment would eventually increase GDP by $4.5 trillion over 20 years. By 2039, business sales or gross output would exceed $5.6 trillion. Fully funding water infrastructure needs would create nearly 800,000 new jobs by 2039. 61% would be in construction and professional services stimulated by the boost in infrastructure spending. But job gains would also come from other sectors like manufacturing that will experience increased productivity thanks to more reliable water service. And wages would rise. US workers would earn more than $2.8 trillion in additional disposable household income over 20 years, leading to an increase of over $2,000 per household. So more reliable water services would also help US households avoid billions of dollars in costs from service disruptions and overflows. And it's worth mentioning here that wages and disposable income are part of a web of interrelated factors that affect health over a lifetime. Studies show that as wages, jobs, and other indicators of economic prosperity improve, so does public health. This model shows that investing in water infrastructure has a positive effect on the economic conditions of people at many income levels. So investing in water infrastructure is a unique opportunity in that it protects public health directly by maintaining safe water quality and indirectly by creating economic conditions that enable people to thrive. What this report makes crystal clear is that water and wastewater infrastructure are interwoven into every aspect of the US economy. Reliable water service is an enabling force for an economic growth and prosperity. Unreliable water service and deteriorating infrastructure, on the other hand, will put the nation's communities and economy at risk. The COVID-19 pandemic only intensifies the need to act and invest across all levels of government. The nation needs leadership to step up and pursue policy and funding solutions that close the water infrastructure investment gap and secure a more resilient, efficient, and reliable water future. So thank you, and Emily, back to you.
Thanks, Katie, and thanks for walking through the highlights from the report. And I'd encourage everybody to check it out on the Value of Water Campaign's website or the ASCE website to see the full report. And so now I think Katie is going to stay with us, and we're going to move on to our panel discussion to really bring some of this data to life. I'm joined also by Carol Haddock and Tony Parrott today. I'll walk quickly through their bios. So Carol Haddock is the director of Houston Public Works, the largest American Public Works Association accredited agency in the nation. She leads almost 4,000 employees in the Houston area, and Houston Public Works includes both water and wastewater, as well as street and storm drainage systems. She's got an annual operating budget of $2.1 billion and an annual capital budget of nearly $1 billion. And she joins us today as Houston is bracing for Hurricane Laura. Carol is also a licensed professional engineer in the state of Texas. She's a former ASCE Board of Direction member, and she also serves on our Committee on America's Infrastructure, which is putting together the 2021 Infrastructure Report Card. Next, we'll have Tony Parrott. Tony's been in the public utility business for over 30 years. After 10 years in the top leadership role of the Metropolitan Sewer District of Greater Cincinnati, he was appointed the executive director of the Louisville-Jefferson County Metropolitan Sewer District, which serves a population of 750,000 residents in the Louisville area. At Louisville MSD, he oversees a 19-year federal consent decree and a capital budget of $188 million, with a goal of bringing safe, clean waterways to the community. He also sits on the board of directors for NACWA and the board of directors for the Water Environment Research Foundation. So thank you to Carol and Tony. And just a quick note to our audience, you can ask questions throughout as the panelists are speaking in the Q&A, and I promise I will get to as many as possible with the time that we have left. But first, I'll start with a question for Tony. One of the headlines from the study that Katie was walking through is that really federal investment is lagging and putting pressure on state and local governments. In particular, federal investment has shrunk from 31% in 1977 to 4% in 2017. What steps has your agency taken, Tony, to shore up the funding gap over the years? And why do you think there should be a federal role continuing in funding water infrastructure?
Thank you. First, let me start by thanking ASCE, the Value of Water Campaign, and also U.S. Water Alliance, and all of the partner organizations for conducting this in-depth research on the substantial impact water infrastructure has on our economy. It is critical that our nation understand water is an essential service that fuels the economy and serves as substantial economic engine. You pointed out the reduction in federal funds that are available for infrastructure investment. It has been a catastrophic event because I think back in the 70s and 80s, folks didn't recognize that there was federal grants that were helping support our local infrastructure programs. And so the true cost of service really was never realized at that point. When you kind of progress into the 1990s, when there was a big push for privatization, there was also a falsehood that the cost of service was lower than it actually was. And when you moved into the 2000s, when you had these major federal consent decrees coming down on local communities, particularly for long-term control plans to reduce combined sewer overflows, it started to kind of affect because rates had to go up because of the lack of federal funds to support those major programs. And those programs were in the billions of dollars for every major U.S. city east of the Mississippi River. And so affordability became an issue as we started to do major consent decree programs. And so now we have a period where we used to have a lot of federal subsidy with grants. Now we have more what we call just low interest loans, whether that be through SRF or whether that be through WIFIA or whether that be through funding from the Army Corps. So what we have been trying to do is to figure out, are there other medium tools that utilities can use to be able to meet the regulatory mandates, such as starting a commercial paper program as another medium for borrowing to fund major capital investments, and also looking at how you can use your surety funds to be able to offset some of those capital needs and resource needs as well. It is something I think going forward, particularly as you start to think about other regulatory requirements and the integrated planning that's going to be necessary, that local entities and local utilities have more of a flexibility to sequence or prioritize how you're going to be able to invest the local dollars that are available to you to address all these needs, whether it be wastewater, whether it be drinking water, stormwater, flood protection, and any future regulations that may hit our wastewater treatment process. So we are really at a crossroads, but I would encourage folks to really maximize the WIFIA process and also pursue the use of maybe commercial paper as an intermediate way of financing your capital program.
Great, thanks, Tony. One for Carol next. So one thing the study does is highlight the fact that most of our nation's water systems were not designed for a changing climate, including impacts from declining surface water flows, sea level rise, saltwater intrusion, you name it. So we know that water infrastructure that's designed to be resilient is essential for our communities to grow and thrive. And you have a lot of experience in Houston on tackling some of these complex problems. What are the unique issues facing water utilities like yours when it comes to making water infrastructure more resilient?
Oh, thank you for that question, and hopefully my connection will hang on really well, because it's telling me I've got a low bandwidth, which is another one of those Zoom lessons that we're learning as we go through this. But I also want to echo my thank you for hosting this event today, that we can talk about these important issues. So I will say in Houston, we're no different than most other cities in the U.S. that throughout time and through changing conditions, through climate, and both through changing population and changing how we use things, we have to adapt and respond. And some of the biggest challenges that we face on a daily basis are the fact that most of our infrastructure is built to last for decades. When we put a pipe in the ground, we expect it to be in service 40, 50, sometimes 60, 100 years. When we build a treatment plant, we expect for that treatment plant to be in the place that it is, even though we change out pumps and motors and internal moving equipment. We plan for those things for 50 to 100 years down the road. And when you look at how we use water, when you look at how we use wastewater, conservation is an absolutely fantastic thing. But when we're reducing the amount of water that's used at every single house, we're actually pulling less water through the pipes, and now we're fighting water age in our system, or we're fighting waste streams in our wastewater treatment plants that are more concentrated than what the plant was originally designed to treat. And so these are the types of challenges. And then when you add on top of that changes in climate, and you add differing rainfall, one of the things that we see when we look at Houston out long term is that we don't see a change in the annual rainfall, but we see a change in the way the annual rainfall comes. And so if we're used to our lakes being refilled, most of the year, as we get a little bit of rain here and a little bit of rain there, and we use water out of our surface water lakes and treat it for drinking water, and it fills back up with the next rainstorm. Well, when we're looking at what happens in climate change, we're looking at 1 or 2 major rain events a year. And will our water supply respond the way that it does today, with the difference in climate and the difference in rainfall patterns and the difference in those things? Houston is known for flooding, which is very unfortunate but true. And so, we're concerned about long term that increasing and even being worse on the flooding side. All of the water that we use is really we call it, it's all one drop. It's all the same drop, whether it's falling out of the sky, we're converting it to safe drinking water, we're treating it as wastewater effluent and returning it to the environment. And so the challenges that we face are, how do we plan for infrastructure that needs to be adaptable throughout its life, not just in the initial installation. The other thing that's a challenge, and this may get into some of our questions that we move down the road, is that there is a general perception in the public that water essentially should be free. It's necessary for life. It is part of our basic fundamental health and safety. And there is a need for us to provide that water. And here during the pandemic, we're actually not disconnecting water service in the city of Houston for non-payment. But we are making it clear to everybody that those bills do eventually have to be paid. We're just not disconnecting the services, because the water is essential for health and life and safety. But we're going to this underfunding by the federal government is putting that back on locals, which is putting it back on ratepayers. And there's a fundamental conflict between affordability, local life safety, and being able to invest sufficiently in our infrastructure to keep it fully funded, adequately staffed, and necessary to provide the safety that's in our water and wastewater treatment systems. So Emily, I'm going to hand it back to you, because I know you've got more questions that are going to take us down some of these topics.
Great, thanks for starting us off. And I think Tony and Carol's remarks kind of highlighted how nimble and quick to adapt utilities really have to be, whether it's constrained budgets, changing climate, and even a pandemic. And I wanted to shift a little bit to jobs and workforce. And one of the interesting findings in this study and previous ones is that water jobs generally pay well. So I have two kind of jobs workforce questions for the entire panel. And one is, what are the workforce challenges that you're facing now? And then looking forward, what are some of the, what does the workforce of the future look like in the water sector? How's that changing?
Well, I'll start on workforce. As you know, 4 years ago, there was a study that looked at 30 major utilities across the country, and with our operational spend and with our capital spend, we would support about 300,000 jobs annually from the water sector. And so I think that may be second or third in the trade sector for job and economic growth in our nation. So jobs are very important in the water and the wastewater sector, particularly in our construction side. As I mentioned earlier, all of us have major capital programs that can support a lot of jobs. And so as we start to continue down that path, we need folks that are going to be able to both skilled and unskilled labor that are going to be able to support our capital programs. And then we're also going to need those individuals that are interested in working for a water or wastewater utility. One of the challenges we have is being able to raise awareness and to be able to brand and recruit the talent. One of the challenges we have is the workforce that works for a lot of water and wastewater utilities is an aging workforce. And we have a lot of our folks that are at or near retirement. And so one of the challenges we are going to have as an industry is how do we tap that next generation workforce, and how do we really hone in on those future jobs that we need inside our utility, particularly electrical engineering, those jobs that support artificial intelligence and technology, and those jobs that will be needed for research and development as we try to reshape and retool and become the utility of the future. The pandemic that we're all going through, we've all had to change the way we do business overnight, and with telework and remote working. So sensor technologies and how we really operate utilities in the future is going to be a big challenge for all of us in the water and wastewater sector. And again, whether it's construction or whether it's within the utility, how do we influence and how do we create awareness and how do we recruit local jobs and create jobs in our communities that will be an economic benefit for the community that we serve?
So I will jump in and echo much of what Tony started with. I will say that we have Houston is certainly challenged by an aging workforce. We more than 50% of my current workforce in all of public works and in the utility is over the age of 55. When you look at that, it's a very scary fact that the majority of more than half of my staff is eligible to retire now or in the next year or two. So those are challenging numbers when you look at them. We have the petrochemical industry that is very large here in Houston. And so we're competing with private industry for employees with the same skill sets. And the petrochemical industry is a little more hire and lay off. And so we have some people that choose to work for the city and work for our utility because they like the stability. But it's very hard to compete with those private sector funding when we look at those things. The other thing that we have to deal with is really how do we attract? How do we attract? And I love that Tony brought up the sensors and the smart city. Our the way we approach utilities for a lot of what we do really hasn't evolved much over the last, at least my career, and some people would say even further, the treatment technologies that we're using. There's a little bit and here and there that's evolved, but we're at a point now where we have an opportunity to make some great advances in implementing and incorporating those smart infrastructure. And part of that is because our infrastructure is aging and needs the reinvestment, that we're at a good time to be able to make those steps forward as we put this money back into our utilities, that we actually can operate our water system throughout the system, not just where we put it in and where we take it out, but throughout the system. That on our wastewater system, that we can look at some more distributed methods of treatment and things of that by using sensors. But right now, even our facilities that are in place, we have to have our operators on site. We're not teleworking from, running our plants from our living rooms. While many of us are able to do a lot of what we do from home, most of our water and wastewater jobs require our employees to be physically at the job to do what they're doing on a day-to-day basis.
Great point. And I am seeing a lot of fantastic questions coming in now from our audience. And so I'm going to try to blend a few where I can. And I'll start with a question really for Katie, but this will be a two-part for everybody. And the first for Katie is, what are the largest investment needs that were identified in the report? Or can you give some examples of the types of investment needs facing the water industry? And then would love to hear Tony and Carol's perspective on what your needs are at your agencies. And then part two is, does the public sector or private sector play a role in funding, or can they, in funding or financing any of this?
Thanks, Emily. The technical report that will be coming out next week will have, or next month, will have a lot more information on subcategories of the capital investment needs. But one of the biggest capital investment needs is just the miles and miles and miles of pipes and conveyance systems that is moving water in and out of our communities. Many of those were installed in the mid 1900s, or sometimes much earlier than that, and they're reaching or are well past their designed useful life. There are technologies to help extend their lifetimes, and those are being deployed in different utilities in really interesting and exciting ways. But at the end of the day, they will need to be replaced and rehabilitated. AWWA came out with a report a few years ago that called it the age of replacement. And I think that that's what we're seeing. Those are huge capital costs, and they represent a very big burden. I think it's worth mentioning too that this report looked at existing systems, and to Carol's point about flooding events becoming more common, and actually to something that Representative Garamendi said at the beginning, we actually need to be looking at the kinds of systems we need in the future. So while this report looked at what replacement needs there might be to basically build replace the capital investments that are in the ground with something similar, we are also facing a challenge where we need something better to meet the future that we face, which is a totally different context than the one in which many of our systems were originally built. So if anything, some of the estimates in the report are conservative for that reason.
Carol or Tony? Nobody wants to go first. Anything
I was going to say. So I talked about the replacement. We, like many utilities, we actually do have a surface water treatment plant that was built and commissioned in 1954 that's still in service, that we're still using today to provide treated drinking water throughout the city of Houston. It's hard to imagine, most people, when you see a car from 1954 on the road, usually it turns your head to look at it because it's like, oh, wow. But, we're still working these things every single day. They're workhorses. But as we look at replacing and upgrading these facilities, it really does become that question of not just more efficient, but how do we make things more resilient to what we anticipate our natural and man-made disasters will be moving forward. The explosion that happened in Lebanon recently was really materials handling man-made. How do we make sure that we're protecting what we're doing? We had in Houston a little over a year ago, we had a small manufacturing facility that had an explosion as well. And so how do we prepare our facilities for things that we're seeing that we didn't anticipate when we built those facilities originally in the 50s, 60s, 70s. In our most recent one, we currently have a facility under construction that will be a 320 million gallon a day water treatment facility. We call it an expansion, but it's really a standalone facility. Even in the process of designing this one, and it's a design build contract, we have continually identified new challenges and incorporated things into the design and the construction as we're going along, that we're learning from the events that are happening in the world today, whether they be natural or man-made, and how different things respond to those things.
I would just say from my perspective, we had 3 years ago identified a 20-year critical repair plan for our wastewater and stormwater infrastructure. And there was a $4 billion need over the next 20 years. And on top of that, we still have work that we're completing with our long-term control plan, and also work that is necessary in our flood protection system, and work that is necessary at the oldest wastewater treatment facility in the state of Kentucky, at our Morris Foreman wastewater treatment plant. So, we have to, as I mentioned earlier, integrated planning and have flexibility and prioritization on how we spend our local dollars. We tried to get funding to kickstart our critical repair plan, and we were unsuccessful in doing that. So we're focused on how do we finish up our long-term control plan? How do we make sure that we are taking advantage of Army Corps funding for flood pump station upgrades and replacements? How do we take advantage of WIFIA and other projects to do our biosolids replacement project, which is another $200 million project, and use that project to create a new way of doing business with thermal hydrolysis, and really using it to create energy to run our facilities, and maybe even sell energy to the grid. And how do we reduce chemical utilization at our wastewater treatment plants? How do we balance the emergency projects that we are faced with because our infrastructure in our city under our streets is failing, our streets are caving in, and how do we balance and fund those and be more proactive rather than reactive? We had a project 2 years ago down the middle of Main Street where we had an opportunity to get out in front of that failure and not close down the main business hub of our city, to be able to repair that project and educate the public on the need for those type of resources to fund replacement. And then a very large CSO tunnel project where we're using that as an example for folks to understand and raise awareness of how critical these assets are and what it takes and how complex it is to manage those assets in the wastewater and the flood protection system.
Great, thank you, Tony. And I think, all of you have reminded us just of the tremendous opportunities there are. As I think Radhika put it, if we seize the moment and make a good bet on investing in the nation's water infrastructure, fixing the water mains and replacing that 54-year-old water treatment plant, but it's also, new technologies like biosolids, the project you were talking about, and sensors. And there's just so many opportunities if we choose to invest. And that's really what this report is about today. So first, I wanted to thank our audience for joining us today, for submitting your questions. Sorry, we did not get through all of them, and engaging in this conversation. I want to thank our panelists, in addition, Representative Garamendi, for joining us today and adding some color to this study that we've put together with the Water Alliance and Value Water Campaign, and really highlighting these issues. They're on the front lines. We're providing essential water services with limited resources and growing challenges, and it's time to meet the moment. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and have a wonderful day.